The morning fog still clung to the rolling hills of Gloucestershire when Detective Inspector Sarah Matthews received the call that would change everything. Her phone buzzed at exactly 6:47 a.m., jolting her from a restless sleep. The voice on the other end belonged to Commander James Sterling, head of the Royal Protection Unit. "Matthews, we need you at Buckingham Palace immediately. This is classified, and I mean the highest level of classification." Sarah had worked on sensitive cases before, but the urgency in Sterling's voice sent chills down her spine. She dressed quickly in her standard dark suit, grabbed her badge and service weapon, and drove through the empty London streets as the city slowly awakened around her. The palace gates opened without the usual security checks. Guards waved her through with somber expressions, their faces tight with concern. Inside the grand corridors, Sarah felt the weight of history pressing down on her shoulders. Portraits of monarchs past seemed to watch her every step as she made her way to Sterling's office. Commander Sterling was a tall man with silver hair and sharp blue eyes that missed nothing. He had served the royal family for over 20 years, and his reputation was legendary within law enforcement circles. When Sarah entered his office, she found him standing by the window, staring out at the palace gardens. "Sit down, Inspector," he said without turning around. "What I'm about to tell you cannot leave this room." Sarah took a seat in the leather chair across from his mahogany desk. The office was filled with commendations, photographs with various royals, and mementos from decades of service. A grandfather clock ticked steadily in the corner, marking each second that passed in tense silence. Sterling finally turned and faced her. 3 days ago, during the routine inventory following Her Late Majesty's passing, we discovered that several priceless heirlooms are missing from the private collection. These aren't just valuable items, Inspector. These are pieces with deep historical significance to the crown. The revelation hit Sarah like a physical blow. The Queen had passed away just 6 months earlier, and the nation was still mourning. The thought that someone had stolen from her private collection felt like a desecration of her memory. "What exactly is missing?" Sarah asked, pulling out her notebook. Sterling moved to his desk and opened a locked drawer, retrieving a manila folder marked with the royal seal. The Empress Marie diamond brooch gifted by the Russian imperial family in 1893, the Wellington Victory Ring, presented to the crown after the Battle of Waterloo, a set of pearl earrings worn by Queen Victoria at her coronation, and most significantly, the Stuart sapphire pendant, which has been in the royal collection for over 400 years. Each item he described represented not just monetary value, but centuries of British history. The Stuart sapphire alone was irreplaceable, having survived the English Civil War and witnessed the rise and fall of dynasties. "Do we have any leads?" Sarah asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. Sterling's expression darkened. "We do, and that's why the situation is so delicate. All evidence points to someone with intimate access to the Queen's private quarters, someone who knew exactly where these items were kept and how to bypass multiple security measures." The implication hung heavy in the air. This wasn't a random burglary or an outsider who had somehow infiltrated the palace. This was an inside job, perpetrated by someone the royal family had trusted implicitly. "Our investigation has led us to focus on one individual," Sterling continued, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "Camilla Thornberry, the Queen's former private secretary. She resigned from her position just 2 weeks before the Queen's passing, citing personal reasons." Sarah knew the name. Camilla Thornberry had served the royal household for 15 years, rising through the ranks to become one of the Queen's most trusted advisors. She had been present at countless private moments, had access to areas of the palace that even senior staff couldn't enter, and knew the royal family's routines better than anyone. "What made her a suspect?" Sarah inquired, though she was beginning to piece together the puzzle. Sterling pulled out several photographs from the folder. They showed a modest country estate surrounded by high hedges and iron gates. 3 weeks ago, Miss Thornberry purchased this property in the Cotswolds. The purchase price was £2.8 million, paid entirely in cash. Her official salary, while generous, would never have allowed for such a purchase. The evidence was compelling, but Sarah knew they needed more than suspicious financial activity to make a case that would hold up in court, especially one involving the royal family. "What's our next move?" "We've been monitoring her activities, and yesterday we received credible intelligence that the missing items are being stored at her estate. We have enough evidence to secure a search warrant, but this needs to be handled with absolute discretion." Sterling leaned forward, his eyes intense. The royal family's reputation, the integrity of the crown, and the public's trust in the monarchy all hang in the balance. Sarah understood the magnitude of what lay ahead. A raid on the estate of a former royal employee would inevitably leak to the press. The scandal would dominate headlines for months, potentially damaging the monarchy's carefully cultivated image during an already difficult transition period. "I'll need a specialized team," Sarah said, her mind already working through the logistics. People with experience in high-profile cases who understand the need for absolute confidentiality. Sterling nodded approvingly. "Already arranged. You'll have Detective Sergeant Michael Chen and Detective Constable Emma Walsh. Both have clearance and experience with sensitive royal matters. You'll also have backup from the Royal Protection Unit." As Sarah prepared to leave Sterling's office, he called her name one final time. "Inspector, I want you to understand something. Camilla Thornberry wasn't just any employee. She was like family to the Queen. Her betrayal, if proven, will devastate not just the institution, but the personal feelings of everyone who trusted her." The weight of that responsibility settled on Sarah's shoulders as she walked back through the palace corridors. In less than 24 hours, she would lead a team to raid the estate of someone who had once held the complete trust of the British monarch. The missing heirlooms were just the beginning of what promised to be one of the most sensitive cases of her career. Detective Inspector Sarah Matthews spent the rest of that day assembling her team and reviewing every detail of Camilla Thornberry's background. The file made for disturbing reading. Born in Yorkshire to a working-class family, Camilla had earned a scholarship to Oxford where she studied history and languages. She joined the royal household at age 26 as a junior secretary and had worked her way up through dedication and intelligence. Detective Sergeant Michael Chen was the first team member Sarah interviewed. A methodical investigator with 15 years of experience, Chen had previously worked on cases involving art theft and high-value fraud. His expertise in tracing stolen artifacts would be crucial if they found the missing heirlooms. "What's your read on this situation?" Sarah asked as they sat in the secure briefing room at Scotland Yard. Chen spread out surveillance photos of Camilla's estate across the table. "The property purchase is definitely suspicious. But what concerns me more is the timing. Resigning just before the Queen's death, then immediately buying an expensive property. It suggests she had advanced knowledge of something." Detective Constable Emma Walsh joined them an hour later. Young but sharp, Walsh specialized in financial crimes and had an uncanny ability to follow money trails through complex transactions. She carried a thick folder of bank records and property documents. "I've been digging into Thornberry's finances," Walsh began, settling into her chair. "The interesting thing isn't just the cash purchase of the estate. It's what happened to her savings in the months leading up to it. She liquidated several investment accounts, closed a pension fund early despite heavy penalties, and took out a significant loan against her London flat." Sarah frowned. That doesn't make sense if she was selling stolen royal heirlooms. Why would she need to access her own money? "That's exactly what puzzles me," Walsh continued. "The timeline suggests she was desperate for cash months before the alleged theft occurred. Either she was planning this for a very long time, or there's something else going on." The team spent hours analyzing surveillance footage from the palace, financial records, and communications intercepts. A pattern began to emerge that painted a more complex picture than a simple theft. Camilla had been receiving mysterious phone calls from an unknown number in the weeks before her resignation. The calls always came late at night and lasted exactly 3 minutes. Chen pulled up the estate surveillance on his laptop. "Look at this footage from last week. A black van arrives at 11 p.m. and leaves 2 hours later. The plates are fake, registered to a company that doesn't exist." Sarah studied the grainy images. The van was large enough to transport substantial items, and its arrival under cover of darkness suggested something illicit was taking place. "Can we identify the occupants?" "Partially," Walsh replied, clicking to another file. Facial recognition picked up one individual. Marcus Delacroix, known art dealer with connections to international smuggling rings. He's been on Interpol's watch list for years but never charged with anything substantial. The revelation changed everything. If Delacroix was involved, this wasn't just a case of an employee stealing from her employer. It suggested an organized operation with international connections, possibly part of a larger network trafficking in stolen cultural artifacts. Sarah's phone rang, interrupting her thoughts. Commander Sterling's voice was tense. "Inspector, we've received word that Delacroix has booked a flight to Geneva for tomorrow evening. If we're going to move on the estate, it has to be tonight." The pressure was mounting. Geneva was known for its discreet private banks and art storage facilities. If the heirlooms reached Switzerland, recovering them would become exponentially more difficult, involving international courts and diplomatic negotiations that could drag on for years. "We'll be ready," Sarah assured him, though privately she wondered if one night was enough time to plan a raid of this magnitude. The team worked feverishly through the afternoon and evening, coordinating with the Royal Protection Unit and obtaining the necessary warrants. Judge Harrison, one of the few magistrates cleared to handle cases involving national security, reviewed their evidence in a closed session and signed the authorization at 9 p.m. Sarah found herself thinking about Camilla Thornberry as they finalized their plans. The woman in the surveillance photos looked tired and anxious, constantly checking her phone and looking over her shoulder. This didn't seem like someone celebrating a successful heist. It looked like someone who was trapped. "I want to talk to her first," Sarah announced as the team prepared to leave for the estate. "Before we search the property, I want to give her a chance to explain what's happening." Chen looked skeptical. "With respect, Inspector, if she's working with international criminals, talking won't accomplish anything. It might even give her time to destroy evidence." "Maybe," Sarah replied, checking her service weapon and adjusting her protective vest. "But something about this case doesn't feel right. A woman with 15 years of faithful service doesn't suddenly become an art thief without a reason." The drive to Camilla's estate took 90 minutes through winding country roads. The team traveled in unmarked vehicles, maintaining radio silence except for essential communications. Sarah found herself gripping the steering wheel tighter as they approached their destination, knowing that the next few hours would determine not just the fate of the missing heirlooms, but potentially the reputation of the entire royal family. The estate appeared peaceful in the moonlight, its Georgian facade illuminated by security lights. Smoke rose from one of the chimneys, indicating that Camilla was home. The property was larger than the surveillance photos had suggested, with extensive gardens and several outbuildings that would need to be searched. Sarah positioned her team around the perimeter, while she approached the front door alone. The doorbell echoed through the house, followed by the sound of footsteps on wooden floors. When Camilla Thornberry opened the door, Sarah was struck by how frail and frightened she appeared. "Ms. Thornberry," Sarah said quietly, showing her warrant card. "I'm Detective Inspector Matthews. I need to speak with you about some items that are missing from the royal collection." Camilla's face went white, and for a moment Sarah thought she might collapse. But instead of denying involvement or demanding to see a warrant, Camilla simply stepped aside and whispered words that would haunt Sarah for years to come. "Thank God you're finally here. I was beginning to think I'd have to take this secret to my grave." Detective Inspector Sarah Matthews followed Camilla Thornberry into the elegant sitting room of her estate, her hand instinctively hovering near her service weapon. The interior was beautifully appointed with antique furniture and original oil paintings, but Sarah's trained eye immediately noticed the heavy curtains drawn tight against the windows and multiple deadbolts on the front door. Camilla moved like a woman carrying an enormous burden. She gestured toward a chintz armchair while she settled onto the sofa opposite, her hands trembling slightly as she poured tea from a service that looked expensive enough to belong in a museum. "You said you were waiting for us to arrive," Sarah began carefully, accepting the delicate porcelain cup. "What did you mean by that?" Camilla closed her eyes and took a shuddering breath. When she opened them again, they were filled with tears. "Inspector, I need you to understand something from the beginning. I never stole anything from Her Majesty. Those heirlooms you're looking for? I didn't take them to sell them. I took them to protect them." The statement hung in the air between them. Sarah set down her teacup and leaned forward. "Protect them from what?" "From Marcus Delacroix and his associates," Camilla replied, her voice gaining strength. "They've been planning to steal those specific pieces for over 2 years. They had inside information about the palace security systems, the storage locations, even the staff schedules." Sarah felt her pulse quicken. "How do you know this?" Camilla stood and walked to an antique secretary desk in the corner. She opened a hidden compartment and withdrew a small recording device. "Because they approached me 18 months ago and tried to recruit me as their inside person." She pressed play, and Sarah heard a cultured male voice with a slight French accent. Ms. Thornbury, we know about your mother's medical bills. Chemotherapy is expensive, isn't it? We're prepared to offer you £2 million for a few hours of cooperation. The recording continued with Delacroix outlining, in chilling detail, how they plan to use Camilla's access to steal not just the 4 missing heirlooms, but dozens of other priceless artifacts from the Queen's private collection. They had blueprints of the palace security systems, knew which guards would be on duty on specific nights, and had even identified the exact combination to the Queen's private safe. My God, Sarah whispered as the recording ended. How did they get this information? They have someone else inside the palace, Camilla said. Someone with access to security protocols and shift schedules. I never found out who, but the level of detail they possessed was terrifying. Sarah's mind raced through the implications. If Delacroix had another accomplice still working within the royal household, the theft attempt could happen at any time. Why didn't you report this to security immediately? Camilla's face crumpled. Because they threatened my mother. She was in the final stages of cancer, completely helpless. They showed me photographs of her in the hospice, knew her room number, her medication schedule, even the names of her nurses. They said if I contacted the authorities, she would die very painfully. The pieces of the puzzle were beginning to fit together. Sarah understood now why Camilla had liquidated her own assets and taken loans against her property. She had been trying to pay for her mother's treatment without accepting money from the criminals. When did your mother pass away? Sarah asked gently. 6 weeks before the Queen died, Camilla replied, fresh tears streaming down her face. The day after the funeral, I made my decision. I couldn't let them desecrate Her Majesty's memory by stealing from her collection. Sarah leaned back in her chair, processing this new information. So you took the heirlooms yourself? I had to, Camilla said firmly. I knew they were planning to move during the transition period after the Queen's death, when security protocols would be disrupted and staff would be distracted by funeral preparations. I couldn't stop them from trying, but I could make sure they found empty display cases. It was a desperate plan, but Sarah had to admit it showed considerable courage. Camilla had risked everything to protect artifacts that represented centuries of British history. Where are the heirlooms now? Sarah asked. Instead of answering, Camilla stood and led her toward a door that opened onto a narrow staircase leading to the basement. I had a proper vault installed, she explained as they descended. Climate-controlled with security systems that would make the Bank of England envious. The basement had been transformed into a professional storage facility. Humidity controls, motion sensors, and multiple cameras monitored every corner. In the center of the room stood a massive safe that must have cost more than most people's cars. Camilla input a long combination and submitted to a biometric scan before the heavy door swung open. Inside, carefully arranged on velvet-lined shelves, were the 4 missing heirlooms. The Stuart sapphire pendant caught the light and threw brilliant blue reflections across the walls. Sarah stared at the collection in amazement. This must have cost you everything you had. It did, Camilla confirmed. The security system, the vault, the renovations to the basement. I spent every penny I could raise, borrowed against everything I owned. I knew I could never return the items while Delacroix and his people were still active, so I resigned from the palace to eliminate any suspicion that I might have inside access. But why didn't you contact the authorities after your mother passed away? Camilla's expression darkened. Because I tried. I called the Royal Protection Unit 3 days after I took the heirlooms. I spoke to someone who claimed to be Commander Sterling's assistant. I told him everything about Delacroix and the planned theft. Sarah felt a chill run down her spine. What happened? Nothing. Absolutely nothing. No follow-up call. No investigation, no increased security at the palace. And then 2 days later, I received another call from Delacroix. He knew I had contacted the authorities. He knew exactly what I had said and to whom I had said it. The implications were staggering. If Delacroix had known about Camilla's attempt to report the planned theft, it meant his inside source had access to the highest levels of royal security. Someone within the Royal Protection Unit itself was feeding information to the criminals. Sarah's radio crackled to life, interrupting her thoughts. Chen's voice came through clearly. Inspector, we have movement at the north gate. Black van approaching, same plates as in our surveillance footage. Sarah looked at Camilla, who had gone pale again. They're coming tonight? They must have learned that I spoke with you, Camilla said, her voice barely above a whisper. Marcus doesn't like loose ends. Sarah keyed her radio. All units, we have a situation developing. Suspect vehicles approaching the estate. Move to intercept positions, but do not engage without my direct order. She turned back to Camilla. Is there another way out of this basement? Camilla nodded toward a door concealed behind a tapestry. Emergency exit. It leads to a tunnel that comes out near the garden shed. Take the heirlooms and go, Sarah ordered. Use the tunnel and get as far from the estate as possible. Call this number when you're safe. She handed Camilla a card with her direct line. What about you? Camilla asked, already moving toward the concealed door. Sarah checked her weapon and adjusted her radio. I'm going to have a conversation with Mr. Delacroix about his travel plans. Detective Inspector Sarah Matthews crouched behind an ornate marble planter in Camilla's garden, watching as 3 figures emerged from the black van that had pulled up to the estate's front entrance. Through her night vision scope, she could see Marcus Delacroix clearly for the first time. He was a tall, elegant man in his 50s, wearing an expensive overcoat and moving with the confidence of someone accustomed to getting what he wanted. Her radio crackled softly as Detective Sergeant Chen reported from his position near the garden shed. Inspector, I have eyes on 2 more individuals circling toward the rear of the property. They're carrying what appears to be electronic equipment. Detective Constable Walsh's voice came through from the north side of the estate. Movement in the woods. At least 3 additional suspects setting up a perimeter. This isn't just a theft attempt, it's a full-scale operation. Sarah's mind raced as she processed the tactical situation. Delacroix had brought at least 8 people to what should have been a simple retrieval operation. Either he suspected that Camilla wasn't alone, or this was always intended to be more than just recovering stolen heirlooms. Through her earpiece, she heard the front door of the estate being forced open. Delacroix's cultured voice carried across the night air as he called out, Ms. Thornberry, there's no point in hiding. We know you're here, and we know what you've taken. Let's discuss this like civilized people. Sarah smiled grimly at his choice of words. There was nothing civilized about threatening an elderly woman with cancer or stealing irreplaceable historical artifacts. She keyed her radio to speak with her team. All units maintain position but be ready to move on my signal. I want Delacroix and his associates taken alive if possible. These people have information we need about their inside contact at the palace. She made her way carefully toward the house, using the landscaping for cover. Through the windows, she could see flashlight beams moving through the rooms as Delacroix's team conducted their search. They were thorough and professional, suggesting they had experience with this type of operation. Check the basement, she heard Delacroix order. The old woman was clever, but not clever enough to hide a £2.8 million security installation. Sarah's heart sank. Somehow, Delacroix knew about the vault Camilla had installed. That level of detailed intelligence could only come from someone with access to financial records, construction permits, or security system installations. His inside source wasn't just within the palace, it was someone with connections throughout London's security infrastructure. A new voice joined the conversation, speaking with a distinctly British accent. Marcus, we need to move quickly. My contact says the police raid was scheduled for tonight. If they find this place empty, they'll expand their search. Sarah's blood ran cold as she recognized the voice. It belonged to Inspector David Morrison, a senior officer within the Royal Protection Unit who had access to operational details of their investigation. Morrison had been present at several of their briefings and knew exactly when and where they planned to raid the estate. Don't worry, David, Delacroix replied smoothly. Ms. Thornberry was thoughtful enough to preserve our property in perfect condition. We'll be gone within the hour. Sarah had to make a decision quickly. Morrison's presence changed everything. He would know standard police procedures and would be able to anticipate how her team was positioned around the estate. She needed to act before they discovered Camilla's escape tunnel and realized the heirlooms were no longer in the vault. She keyed her radio and whispered urgently, All units, be advised that Inspector Morrison from Royal Protection is on site and appears to be cooperating with the suspects. Consider him hostile and do not trust any communications that might come from him. Chen's response was immediate. Copy that, Inspector. That explains how they knew our operational details. Sarah moved closer to the house, reaching a position where she could observe the front entrance and most of the ground floor windows. Through the glass, she watched Delacroix's team methodically searching each room. They moved with military precision, suggesting these weren't common criminals but professionals with substantial training. Morrison appeared in the doorway, speaking into a radio. Sarah realized with alarm that he was probably in communication with other members of the Royal Protection Unit, potentially compromising their entire operation. "Strike Team Alpha, this is Inspector Morrison," she heard him say. "The situation at the estate is secure. Maintain current positions and await further orders." Sarah quickly switched to her emergency channel and contacted Commander Sterling directly. "Sir, we have a major problem. Inspector Morrison is on site and appears to be working with the suspects. He's issuing false commands to our backup units." Sterling's response was immediate and terse. "Understood, Inspector. Morrison has been feeding information to unknown parties for months. We suspected but couldn't prove it until now. You have full authority to handle this situation as you see fit." Armed with that authorization, Sarah felt a surge of confidence. She had the best tactical team available, and they now had clear evidence of the conspiracy that had been operating within the royal security apparatus. "Chen, Walsh, we're moving to apprehend all suspects," she announced over the radio. "Morrison is considered extremely dangerous as he knows all our standard procedures." Sarah approached the house from the side, staying low and using the ornamental shrubs for cover. Through a window, she could see into Camilla's sitting room where Morrison was standing over the antique desk, apparently searching through papers and documents. Delacroix's voice carried from the basement. "David, the vault is empty. Your intelligence was correct about its existence, but someone got here first." "That's impossible," Morrison replied, moving toward the basement stairs. "I monitored all police communications. No raid was conducted before tonight." Sarah smiled as she realized that Camilla's independent action had completely confounded the conspirators. They had planned for every possible police response, but never considered that their intended victim might take preemptive action to protect the heirlooms. She positioned herself at the front door, weapon drawn, and took a deep breath. The next few minutes would determine whether they could capture Delacroix's entire network or whether the criminals would escape to continue their operations. "Elsewhere, this is Detective Inspector Matthews, Metropolitan Police," she announced loudly, her voice carrying through the house. "The property is surrounded. You have 30 seconds to exit the building with your hands visible." The response was immediate chaos. Shouts erupted from inside the house, followed by the sound of breaking glass as someone attempted to escape through a rear window. Sarah heard gunshots from the back of the property where Walsh was positioned. "Inspector, suspects attempting to flee through the rear garden," Walsh reported. "2 in custody, but Morrison and Delacroix are still mobile." Sarah kicked in the front door and entered the house, her weapon ready. The sitting room was empty, but she could hear footsteps running across the floor above her head. Morrison's voice came from upstairs, speaking rapidly into his radio. "Command, this is Morrison. Officer down, requesting immediate backup at grid reference 447892. Multiple armed suspects. Shots fired." Sarah realized he was calling for additional royal protection officers, potentially bringing innocent personnel into a dangerous situation, while portraying himself as the victim rather than a conspirator. She bounded up the stairs 2 at a time, following the sound of Morrison's voice. At the top of the landing, she found herself face to face with Inspector Morrison, who was pointing his service weapon directly at her chest. Detective Inspector Sarah Matthews stared down the barrel of Inspector Morrison's service weapon, her own gun trained steadily on his chest. The hallway of Camilla's estate seemed to stretch endlessly between them, lit only by the moonlight streaming through a tall window. Morrison's face was twisted with desperation, sweat beading on his forehead despite the cool night air. "Put your weapon down, Matthews," Morrison commanded, though his voice carried none of the authority it once had. "You don't understand what you're interfering with here." "I understand perfectly," Sarah replied calmly, keeping her weapon steady. "You've been selling information to international art thieves, betraying everything you swore to protect when you joined the Royal Protection Unit." Morrison's laugh was bitter and hollow. "You think this is about money? You have no idea what's really happening here." From downstairs, Sarah could hear her team moving through the house, systematically clearing each room. Chen's voice came through her earpiece. "Inspector Delacroix is barricaded in the basement. He's armed and refusing to surrender." "I need you to explain it to me then," Sarah said to Morrison, though she kept her finger on the trigger. Help me understand why a decorated officer with 20 years of service would throw away his career to help criminals steal from the crown." Morrison's weapon wavered slightly, and for a moment Sarah saw past his desperation to the pain beneath. "My daughter Emma, she's 8 years old, Matthews. They took her 3 months ago." The revelation hit Sarah like a physical blow. She had been so focused on the theft and conspiracy that she hadn't considered the possibility that Morrison might be a victim as well as a perpetrator. "Delacroix has been holding her?" Sarah asked, though she didn't lower her weapon. "Not Delacroix directly. His organization has connections throughout Europe. They took her from her school in Edinburgh, made it look like a family dispute during my divorce proceedings. My ex-wife thinks I'm hiding Emma from her. The police think Emma is with me, but she's being held somewhere in Eastern Europe, and the only way to get her back is to give Delacroix what he wants." Sarah felt her resolve waver. As a police officer, she had seen how criminal organizations used family members as leverage. As a mother herself, she couldn't imagine the anguish Morrison must be experiencing. "David," she said, using his first name for the first time, "this isn't the way to save her. These people are killers. Even if you give them everything they want, they'll never let Emma go because she can't identify them." Morrison's weapon began to shake noticeably. "You don't know that. I've done everything they asked for 8 months. I provided security schedules, architectural plans, personnel files. They promised me that once they recovered the heirlooms, Emma would be released." "And you believed them?" Sarah asked gently. "David, they were never planning to return your daughter. They need you to keep providing information. Emma is their guarantee that you'll remain cooperative." The truth of her words seemed to hit Morrison like a physical blow. His shoulders sagged, and for the first time since Sarah had known him, he looked every one of his 53 years. "Oh, God," he whispered. "What have I done?" Sarah took a careful step forward. "You can still save her, David, but not by helping criminals. Help us capture Delacroix's entire network. Give us the information we need to track down where they're holding Emma." Morrison's radio crackled to life. Delacroix's voice came through clearly. "David, I'm afraid our arrangement is at an end. The police have surrounded the basement, and my sources tell me that Detective Inspector Matthews has been asking very specific questions about our mutual friend." Sarah's heart sank as she realized what Delacroix was implying. If he was referring to Emma as their mutual friend, it meant he was prepared to eliminate the one witness who could identify his organization. "No," Morrison breathed, the color draining from his face. "You promised she wouldn't be harmed as long as I cooperated." "Circumstances have changed," Delacroix replied coldly. "However, I'm prepared to honor our original agreement if you can neutralize Detective Inspector Matthews and ensure my safe passage from this estate." Sarah watched Morrison's face as the full horror of his situation became clear. Delacroix wasn't just asking him to facilitate an escape. He was ordering him to commit murder to save his daughter's life. "David," Sarah said softly, "you know this won't end with me. Even if you do what he's asking, he'll just make more demands. This is how these organizations operate. They never release their leverage." Morrison's weapon was shaking so violently now that Sarah wasn't sure he could hit her even if he tried to shoot. Tears were streaming down his face as 8 months of anguish and guilt finally overwhelmed him. "I can't," he sobbed. "I can't do this anymore. But I can't lose Emma either." Sarah made a decision that went against every tactical manual she'd ever studied. She slowly lowered her weapon and took another step toward Morrison. "You're not going to lose her," she said firmly. "I give you my word that we'll find Emma and bring her home safely. But I need you to trust me and put down your gun." Morrison stared at her for a long moment, his breathing ragged and desperate. Finally, his arm dropped to his side, and he let his service weapon clatter to the floor. Sarah immediately moved forward and secured Morrison's weapon while speaking into her radio. "All units, Inspector Morrison is in custody and cooperating. I need an immediate trace on all communications to and from this location for the past 6 hours." Detective Inspector Sarah Matthews helped Inspector Morrison to a chair in Camilla's guest bedroom, noting how his hands continued to shake even after surrendering his weapon. The weight of 8 months carrying such a terrible secret had clearly taken its toll on the man who had once been considered one of the Royal Protection Unit's most reliable officers. "Tell me everything about how they contacted you," Sarah said gently, pulling up another chair to face him. "Every detail could help us find Emma." Morrison wiped his eyes with the back of his hand and took a shuddering breath. It started with a phone call to my personal mobile. A woman with an Eastern European accent said they had Emma, and that I would receive proof within the hour. 20 minutes later, a courier delivered an envelope with photographs of Emma in what looked like a comfortable room, but with bars on the windows. Sarah made notes as Morrison continued his account. The photographs had been taken weekly, always showing Emma in different clothes but the same barred room. Sometimes there were newspapers visible in the shots with current dates, proving she was alive and the photos were recent. The woman would call every few days with specific requests, Morrison explained. At first it was just basic information about palace security routines. When the guards changed shifts, which entrances were used by different staff members, that sort of thing. But then the request became more specific. When did Delacroix become involved directly? Sarah asked. About 4 months ago. The woman told me I would be meeting with her employer to discuss a special project. Delacroix contacted me and arranged a meeting at a hotel in Kensington. He was charming, well-dressed, spoke perfect English. He treated the whole thing like a business transaction. Sarah's radio interrupted their conversation. Chen's voice came through urgently. Inspector, we have Delacroix in custody, but he's demanding to speak with you personally before he'll cooperate. What's his condition? Sarah asked. Uninjured but claiming diplomatic immunity. He's got a Belgian passport and says he's an official art dealer working on behalf of a European museum. Sarah sighed. Diplomatic immunity claims were always complicated, even when they were fraudulent. Keep him secured, but don't transport him yet. I'll be down in 5 minutes. She turned back to Morrison. David, I need you to think carefully. Did Delacroix or anyone else ever mention where Emma might be held? Any casual references to cities, buildings, even weather conditions? Morrison closed his eyes, concentrating. There was one call where I could hear church bells in the background, very distinctive, like cathedral bells rather than a small parish church. And once the woman mentioned that Emma was asking for fish and chips, but they could only get her something called kebapçiçi. That's a Balkan dish, Sarah said, making another note. Probably Bosnia, Serbia, or Montenegro. The church bells suggest an old city with a large cathedral. Her phone buzzed with a text message from Commander Sterling. Matthews, Interpol has identified Delacroix's operation. Multiple arrests underway across Europe. Need immediate debrief on Morrison's intelligence. Sarah helped Morrison to his feet. David, you're going to be transferred to a secure facility where you'll work with our International Crimes Unit to help locate Emma. But first I need you to speak with Delacroix. He might be more willing to cooperate if he thinks you're still following his orders. They made their way downstairs to the basement where Delacroix sat handcuffed in Camilla's elegant sitting room, flanked by 2 armed officers. Despite his situation, he maintained the composed demeanor of a man accustomed to being in control. Inspector Matthews, he said pleasantly when she entered. I understand you've had quite an interesting conversation with our mutual friend David. Mr. Delacroix, Sarah replied, taking a seat across from him. I'm told you have something to discuss. Indeed, I'm prepared to offer you information about our operation in exchange for certain considerations regarding my legal status. Sarah leaned back in her chair. Before we discuss any deals, I want to know about Emma Morrison. Where is she being held? Delacroix's smile didn't waver. Inspector Morrison's daughter is quite safe, I assure you. She's being cared for by people who have experience looking after children whose parents have made poor choices. The casual cruelty in his tone made Sarah's blood boil, but she kept her expression neutral. That's not what I asked. The child's location is part of the information I'm prepared to trade, Delacroix replied smoothly. But I'll need guarantees about my own situation first. Morrison stepped forward, his voice cracking with emotion. Marcus, please, I did everything you asked. I gave you access to the palace, security codes, staff schedules. All I want is my daughter back. Delacroix looked at Morrison with something approaching pity. David, you were never in control of the situation. You were a tool, nothing more. Did you really believe we would risk exposure by releasing the one person who could identify our entire network? The words hit Morrison like physical blows. Sarah watched as the last of his hope crumbled, replaced by a rage that had been building for 8 months. You never intended to release her, Morrison said quietly. Of course not, Delacroix replied matter-of-factly. Emma is a valuable asset. She ensures your continued cooperation, and she provides leverage for future operations. Morrison lunged toward Delacroix with a cry of anguish, but the armed officers restrained him before he could reach the art dealer. Sarah made a quick decision. Get Mr. Delacroix out of here, she ordered. Transport him to the yard for formal processing. I want him in an interview room within the hour. As Delacroix was led away, he called back over his shoulder. Inspector, you have 48 hours before Emma's situation becomes permanent. I suggest you consider my offer carefully. Sarah felt the weight of responsibility settle on her shoulders. Not only did she need to recover the stolen royal heirlooms and unravel an international art theft conspiracy, but a child's life now hung in the balance. Her phone rang with a call from Commander Sterling. Matthews, excellent work tonight. Camilla Thornberry contacted us 20 minutes ago from a secure location. She has all 4 heirlooms and is prepared to return them to the palace immediately. What about Morrison and Delacroix? Sarah asked. Morrison will cooperate fully with our investigation. As for Delacroix, Interpol has been tracking his organization for 3 years. Tonight's operation has given us enough evidence to roll up his entire network. We should have the location of the Morrison girl within 24 hours. Sarah looked around Camilla's ransacked sitting room, thinking about the courage it had taken for an elderly woman to single-handedly protect irreplaceable historical artifacts from international criminals. Morrison sat slumped in his chair, emotionally drained but finally free from the impossible burden he had carried for so long. Sir, Sarah said into the phone, I want to personally escort the heirlooms back to the palace. After everything they've been through, they deserve a proper homecoming. Agreed, Inspector. And Matthews, outstanding work tonight. The royal family will be informed that their treasures are safe, and the integrity of the crown has been preserved. As dawn broke over the Cotswold countryside, Sarah reflected on how a case that began with missing jewelry had uncovered a conspiracy that reached into the highest levels of royal security. The missing heirlooms would be returned to their rightful place. Camilla Thornberry would be recognized as a hero rather than a criminal, and Inspector Morrison would have a chance to rebuild his life once his daughter was safely home. The Stuart sapphire pendant, the Empress Marie diamond brooch, the Wellington Victory ring and Queen Victoria's coronation pearls had survived another chapter in their centuries-long history, protected not by palace guards or sophisticated security systems, but by the courage of one woman who refused to let criminals desecrate the memory of the monarch she had served faithfully for 15 years.